Hello everyone and welcome to Chapter 18 with me, Andrea Sharpenstein. And today we're going to talk about ecology. We're going to introduce it a little bit along with some other factors. Alright, so first let's talk about the definition of ecology. Ecology is all about how organisms interact with their environments and vice versa. There are two parts that make up the environment that we touched on in one of our first chapters. I think it was chapter 1. But we'll get a bit more details about those factors today. So we have the biotic and abiotic factors. First on the list is abiotic, and that's everything non-living. So nutrients, sunlight, water. It consists of all non-living chemical and physical factors. And then we have the biotic component, and bio, life. Biotic includes all of the living factors, so everything that's alive in that environment. And because ecology is so vast, we divide it into 4 comprehensive levels that pretty much cover it. We start small scale, we start at organismal ecology, and we get progressively more complicated with each increasing level. So we start at organismal ecology, then we move on to population ecology, then community ecology, and then finally ecosystem ecology. So first step, organismal biology. This focuses on evolutionary adaptations that allow individual organisms to live effectively in their environments and to meet the challenges posed by these abiotic environments that they're dwelling in. So for example, think about it like this. What adaptation would this whale in this picture have? So what adaptations would it have to meet the challenges of living in the ocean? Think about how they're mammals that live in a water environment, but they still breathe air. Think about what they eat. Think about how they work with temperature changes. Just think along those different lines. Next step, population ecology. This focuses on populations. So remember the definition of populations? It focuses on groups of individuals of the same species living in the same area. With population ecology, we look at density, so the thickness of populations, and then we also look at growth and decline of populations. And then a little bigger onto community ecology. And this looks at the community, all of the different species, and how different species interact together. For example, predator-prey interactions between species, different plant diversities and dispersals, and how they interact and affect the structure and organization of communities. So see how it's getting more all-encompassing. And now we're at ecosystem ecology. So this includes all of the abiotic factors plus the community of species in a certain area. Here we look at energy flow and cycles. So more on that in a moment. We're definitely about to talk about energy flow and different nutrient cycles. And lastly, we get to the biosphere, the global ecosystem. And this global ecosystem is what we call Earth. So this is our planet. Looking at Earth, there are patterns that pop up, some pretty cool patterns actually, in the distribution of terrestrial and aquatic life. For example, we have different biomes, which are climates, and to make this make sense, think about rainforests, think about deserts, grasslands, all of these are different biomes or climates. And think about the differences in temperature in each of these areas, differences in rainfall, etc., etc. Then we have habitats. Habitats are where organisms live. So these are their environments, including biotic and abiotic factors, so living and non-living factors. I'm sure at this point you're all recognizing how everything relates back to things we've previously talked about. Well, ecology and evolution are very, very tightly linked. Evolutionary adaptations through natural selection results from ecology or the interaction of organisms within their environments. This image is of a daisy. It lives in rocks, and it's actually the closest living relative to the elephant. And they've definitely changed based on their environments, based on how they look, and all that good stuff. You can read more about that online. Then we have physiological, anatomical, and behavioral adaptations that enable or let organisms adjust to changes in their environments. So to be more fit, to send more offspring out and about, these adaptations occur. Physiology is function and anatomical changes, changes in anatomy, and we have behavioral changes, and we'll talk about all of these with this elephant. So this is an African elephant. Physiologically, elephants have trunks that act as our hands. So you can look up videos how they use their trunks to perform different tasks and how they use their trunks to sense different chemicals. And they have something called a vomeronasal organ. You can look that up. Anatomically, we know this is an African elephant because it has very large ears in comparison to the other elephants. This adaptation allows these guys to sense sounds our ears can't sense. And then a behavioral example of this elephant is that it has coated itself in mud. Essentially, this is important because it's basically covered itself with sunscreen to protect itself from harsh sun rays. Covering itself with mud also allows it to cool itself down. So you splash cool mud all over your body, you'd think that'd cool you down. Pretty cool, right? Most people love elephants, so it's always nice to give some elephant examples here and there. Next, we have two different population growth models that help us keep track of population growth. And they show us how things function in an ecosystem. One model is called the exponential growth model, and that's represented here in red. And then the other is the logistic growth model, represented in blue, and I'll talk about each individually. This letter K right here it refers to carrying capacity, and I will give you more details about that too. So first, the exponential growth model. This deals with ideal conditions, and the rate of population would expand under these perfect, unregulated conditions. Here, there is nothing to stop growth. A good example of the exponential growth model is making bacteria cell colonies in a lab, or in this example, specifically in a flask. You have lots of nutrients and ideal conditions. Notice this growth curve in the graph. The plotted points, they correlate directly with this chart right here. And notice how as each time passes, the number of cells grow exponentially. It starts at 2 to the 0 power, and the exponents get bigger. So 2 to the 1, 2 to the 2, 2 to the 3. And if you think about that numerically, we start at 1 cell. This 1 cell divides into 2. The 2 divide, then you have 4. The 4 divide, then you have 8, and so on and so forth. And notice this is due to perfect, ideal, unregulated conditions. In nature, a population could grow exponentially for a time, but eventually some kinds of environmental factors will limit its growth, aka the population limiting factor. This restricts population growth, as its name indicates. This bucket in this example right here shows some examples of limiting factors. So we have light, heat, mechanical support, organic matter, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen. We have other nutrients, we have water, and we have air. The lowest level here, as you can see, is potassium. This means that your population can grow only to a level supported by this amount of potassium. It does not matter how much other stuff you have. The moment you've hit the one limiting factor, there's no more growth. And in this example, the moment you hit this limiting factor right here, potassium, this much potassium, there's no more growth. Therefore, we have more of a logistic growth model. If you look at this graph, Notice how the beginning of the curve starts out looking a little like the exponential growth model, but then we get this slowing down happening right here. If you look at this picture of seals, they look pretty crammed, right? So we can hypothesize that their limiting factor was the amount of space. So they lack extra space, so this is how big their population gets, and it basically stabilizes, slows down in growth. So remember that slowing down we just talked about? That's called hitting the point of carrying capacity. So that K stands for carrying capacity. And it's the number of individuals that a population can contain with no increase or decrease. So when that line on the graph in the previous slide, this one, starts looking horizontal, so right here, that means we've hit the carrying capacity. This is a deer example. Low population, we have pretty low population in wintertime. And then in the spring, females give birth, their population increases, but then as the year progresses, the deer surplus can decrease due to many factors, and we get back down to our carrying capacity. So we have factors like starvation, disease, accidents, weather, we have hunting, predators, and then we have just a little other grab bag of different things that could happen to make this deer surplus decrease. And fun fact, we allow hunting because it helps us control deer populations so that they don't get too high. However, if we had more wolves, a lot of hunting wouldn't be necessary because we'd have more natural predators helping control for the carrying capacity. We, as the human population, have been growing exponentially. According to this graph, we have not hit our carrying capacity. However, many scientists think we've surpassed it. We're using resources at a very unsustainable rate, and that's pretty unfortunate, all to maintain our too large population. Our death rate subtracted from our birth rate determines our growth. The more births compared to deaths means that our population is growing. In more advanced countries, you'll see a decreased birth rate, and this decreased birth rate happens due to an important factor. This factor is the education of women. When women have the ability to get educated and family plan, populations decrease and family size decreases, and we as Homo sapiens become more sustainable. So this is incredibly, incredibly important. Didn't think we'd get into that in this class, did you? But it is. Biology is all-encompassing. Now let's talk about climate change. No other country debates climate change except for ours. The world as a whole knows this to be a fact. Climate change is happening. Scientists agree. It's happening, and it's happening because of us. You may think, oh, global warming, it's not warm. Where I live, we have cold winters. Well, it's not just warming everywhere at the same time. The average temperatures are increasing, but this leads to more extreme, so emphasis on more extreme winters and summers and increased droughts. So this triggers some areas to actually decrease in temperature. And this has very terrifying effects for our world. And that's why trying to reduce the amount of carbon emissions is really important. And that's why the push for green technology is so important. We'll talk about carbon dioxide increases in a second and how it increases global warming. But first, let's talk about a specific example like this polar bear. So polar bears go on ice and swim with offsprings to mainland. As that ice decreases due to melting of polar ice caps, those polar bears have to swim longer distances, and now we're seeing decreases in polar bear survivability, which is pretty sad to think about. Precipitation patterns have also changed. There are droughts in California and there are droughts in parts of Europe. Then on the other end of the spectrum, countries like Bosnia, where I was born, and the UK have seen flooding. Very large differences in rain patterns. Very, very large differences. The evidence implicating human enterprises as responsible for climate change is overwhelming. If you look this up, make sure to take note of what source you're getting it from. Who's paying for this research? Is it published in a peer-reviewed journal? And really read about what the authors have to say. Back in the 70s, some authors published they published about global cooling, and they had a global cooling hypothesis. And both of those authors really, really regret that because they found more information and agree that it's actually global warming. Now let's look at the hows and whys of global climate change. Patterns are changing due to the rising concentration of greenhouse gases. Think about a greenhouse. Think about it trapping heat. That's what these gases are doing to Earth. They are trapping heat in our atmosphere instead of reflecting it out. Greenhouse gases absorb heat and they allow it to reflect back. Carbon dioxide is a big one. Methane is another very large one. Water vapor. And this all contributes to increases in global temperature. The largest changes are occurring at our poles, our northern hemisphere and Antarctica. And it is completely undebatable that human activity is the reason for this. Since the Industrial Revolution really it allowed us to streamline, but it also allowed us to produce a lot of waste. I mean, look at this increase in carbon dioxide emissions in the years following the Industrial Revolution. It just is insane. Insane amount of increase. So how did this accumulate in our atmosphere? So remember, during photosynthesis, plants take carbon dioxide in to make sugars, and this pretty much balances out with the release of carbon dioxide during cellular respiration. Well, the release of carbon dioxide is not equal anymore. It has heavily increased since the Industrial Revolution. When we take out trees, we don't have as many plants left to photosynthesize and take in CO2. Then we burn fossil fuels and wood, and we release extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Another proportion of greenhouse gases is CH4, otherwise known as methane. And cow flatulence helps with the increase of methane. One cow makes as much gas in a year as a car driving 80,000 miles. And 30% of our earth is covered with livestock. So am I saying stop eating cows? No, I'm just giving you something to think about. Critical thinking and science literacy are very important factors in this day and age. This picture shows you how carbon dioxide goes in the atmosphere and back to land. We just talked about carbon dioxide being taken in by plants and released out by cellular respiration. The combustion of fossil fuels sends a lot of carbon dioxide out, and the ocean is also something that holds carbon dioxide. So why else does climate change matter? How does it affect ecosystems? In a lot of plants and animals, warming temperatures and or daylight triggers life cycle events. So these temperatures or day length can trigger very huge life cycle events. For example, short day breeders and long day breeders. So moose are short day breeders. That means that as daylight decreases and winter approaches, moose mating happens. Then by spring, their offspring are ready to be birthed. And when there's a lot of vegetation, offspring have better survivability. And we have our long day breeders like weasels. As our daylight becomes longer, they'll mate, and due to their shorter gestation period or pregnancy length, they'll still breed in spring. But if they're going by daylight and daylight is affected, then they may miss their chance, or the offspring will be born in conditions where they have worse survivability. Another example, a plant may bloom before pollinators have emerged, which is very important. Even different phenotypes can be based on daylight. The snowshoe hare is white in winter to blend in with snow and brown in summer to blend in with the ground. This makes snowshoe hares less conspicuous to predators. And if this daylight was affected. Like, for example, if the snow melted earlier, obviously snowshoe hares would get picked off more easily by predators, because they're not blending in with their landscape as well, because the white fur is still there when it hasn't had enough time to change to brown. Now let's move on to catastrophic wildfire seasons. These are other effects of climate change. Drought areas like California have seen many of these, unfortunately, due to how dry they've gotten. A way to change this is by practicing good management. Burning is a natural part of the ecosystem. It resets the ecosystem. It brings nutrients back to the soil, and you can see levels of succession. So we start with grass, then it becomes a long prairie, then we get some trees, and eventually it will become a forest again, a pretty nutrient-rich forest. This takes years of building up to get to the forest level. Controlled burns are important ecosystem-wise as well. And then another example is the bark beetle. When it's warm, they spread faster because they breed 2 times a year instead of just once. And they're pretty detrimental and are basically killing our trees by drilling in them. Now we move on to deforestation, fragmentation, and desertification. 3 very important topics for ecology and ways we're changing the environment. So deforestation for farming, and cut and burns, reduce wildfire habitats, decreases photosynthesizers that take in carbon dioxide, and it messes with soil, so soil may erode and not be as nutrient rich anymore. And with fragmentation, we see the edge of trees. Basically, more edges happen overall, and some species only live in the middle. So some species don't live on edges of forests, especially birds. So as forests keep getting cut and more edges are happening, birds won't survive very well because they don't have their own habitat. And then we have desertification. This happens when grasslands turn to desert. The western U.S. used to have bison and elk more throughout, but the numbers aren't stable anymore. That area doesn't get nutrients from those animals' feces. That area dries out and it dies and it becomes a desert, and deserts spread. A good idea is to put in livestock to help maintain those areas, to help maintain the nutrient richness with their feces. And this is a way excess cows could be helpful. And I want you to think about this sign. Trees are worth more than you'd guess. Think about photosynthesis. They make so much oxygen. They help take in pollution. They help with soil fertility. They help with water by helping it stay through their long roots, and they don't forget about, and then I don't want you to forget about the different fruits and lumber that trees provide us with all the time. So our greenhouse emissions have been rising. We need politics to come in and help us. It shouldn't be any sort of argument. It's not party biased. It's just there. It's just happening. And we need to do something about it. The only way it's political is in the manner that laws need to be passed in order for help, for environmental help. We should all be for making a healthier United States for everyone. Think about the future and your future kids or grandkids or great-grandkids. What will they have to face if we don't take steps now? The worst possible thing that'll happen if we make these changes is that the world will be cleaner. And that doesn't sound so bad, right? I think we can all agree. So on an individual level, to help with climate change, you can try and lessen your carbon footprint. You can do this by recycling, reducing your use of electricity. For example, unplug your phone chargers if they're not charging your phones. Have your air conditioning set at 73 instead of 68 in the summer. Just little tiny changes like that can show really big global changes. It starts at the person. I wish public transportation was bigger here because that helped with driving less. Also, back to recycling. If you live in Warren County limits, you're already paying for recycling with BGMU. So all you have to do is call Southern Recycling and they'll give you a box. They will just give you a box because you're already paying for it. So why pay for it and not recycle? You might as well go pick up the free box and start recycling. A few places trash goes. When I learned about this as an undergraduate, I was very shocked. I was pretty unaware of this. So I knew that your trash can go into a trash heap. I think that's what we all assume. But a lot of it ends up in the ocean. There are so many different trash gyres, like basically little trash continents in each of our major oceans. There's a trash gyre in the Pacific Ocean that's 2 times larger than Texas. 2 times larger than the state of Texas. Think about that. A lot of waste accumulates and marine life gets caught in it and gets affected. And there is a push. There is definitely a push right now for trying to clean this up, but it's hard to clean this up without making the problem worse, without adding to the trash. New technology is needed. Things you can do to help. Instead of throwing stuff away, you can reuse it, like soda bottles. In this example, these soda bottles are used for growing herbs. It looks pretty cool on that wall too. Composting is really nutrient rich for gardens. So to compost, don't use dairy or meat waste, but use different vegetable wastes, coffees, and then you don't have to buy fertilizer because eventually you can use that as your fertilizer, and it is incredibly nutrient rich. Additionally, you can eat locally. You can go to one of several farmers markets in town. They don't have to transport things all over the world. It's quick, it's easy, they leave a low carbon footprint, and it wouldn't hurt to support your local community, to support people that are living in your community that are growing these things. Could also be healthier. So what species could adapt if climate change gets worse? The species most likely to adapt already have high genetic variability and or already have shorter lifespans. For example, they can produce more generations in a shorter period of time. So an elephant may take 20 years between generations, whereas a mouse takes maybe a few weeks between generations. Mice will go through more generations in a shorter amount of time, and they'll have more evolution possible. Something that's important to think about, we are in the 6th extinction period. It is time to make a change. So to finish this up, let's look at some misconceptions about global warming. So, global warming does not mean it will never get cold. It can actually get extra cold in some areas and see these bigger extremes in colder winters and warmer summers. Look at the increased snowstorms of the past few years. Don't tell me that's something that you've been seeing forever. It's not a normal temperature fluctuation. We'll look at a graph in a second. It's not a big plot. Here we go. Sorry. It's not a big plot, and it has a huge effect on us. The most comprehensive information you'll find is on CopenhagenDiagnosis.com. Check it out for yourself if I haven't convinced you with this lecture. So these are definitely misconceptions about global warming. And this is that graph that shows temperature, so 20,000 to 100,000 years before now. You can see this increase right here. And we basically stayed here. But if we zoom in on most recent years, we have this hockey stick graph. So get how it could be a hockey stick shape. And this shows how we started this extreme increase in the 1900s. So right here. This is not a normal fluctuation. If you look, these are normal fluctuations. We hit the Industrial Revolution and boom, huge increase. Scientists collect this data through ice cores. They go to the Arctic and they'll take deep samples going through layers of ice, kind of like tree rings. You can see each year, and you can see what the area looked like and the temperature of those ice cores. It's really amazing how far science has gotten. So I hope with this lecture I've given you some things to think about, and I hope that you'll pass on this information to others. Anything we do helps, so don't think that you're only one person and it doesn't matter, because it does matter. It starts at the individual. So make some changes. Help us. Help the world. And that's it for this chapter. Thanks for listening.